We often work jointly under federal law, either at Superfund or circular or national priority list sites, or in the case of Bouchard, also under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. So some cases are settled solely by our state trustee, and some are settled jointly with our federal trustee partners. And in Massachusetts, the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs is our sole trustee. And so there are certain activities that only the trustee can undertake. But in terms of the day-to-day management of the program and the administration, that authority, those activities have been delegated to DEP by the trustee. The federal trustees that we work with the most often are the first two under the list, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But federally recognized tribes are also trustees. We haven't had a case yet where we've worked with a tribe, but many states have multi-trustee efforts. This is just give you a sense of the range of the settlements we have achieved to date. I mentioned Bouchard is actually, we just got the second part of the Bouchard settlement finalized, and so the total is now nearly $20 million. The second part of the settlement related to the bird species that were harmed by the spill. But it can be down to, for example, there are state-only spills. The J.P. Noonan spill, which Alicia is very familiar with, was in the Upper Mystic in Medford and Arlington, and it was settled by the state, and both the city and the town are implementing restoration projects, and I'll highlight that later in this meeting. So, when we talk about what we're here to focus on today, that was sort of the big picture in terms of the program and the broad authority. Yes?
Yeah, just since we're moving on to this,
Yep.
back to that.
Yep.
So you cited the regulations that grant you the authority as a trustee to pursue natural resource damages. Do those regulations, where do you find the details on how you determine what a natural resource damage is, I guess, in terms of quantifying?
Sure. So I'm just going to repeat that for folks on the phone. So the question was, in terms of the authorities under which we pursue natural resource damages, where do we find the, methods or approaches that guide how we would pursue a case? That's it. Well, that's one of the reasons we're here today, because we have the statutory authority in Massachusetts. We don't actually have regulations, and that's part of the reason we're developing the regulatory package. On the federal side, the Department of Interior, as well as NOAA, have regulations that specify the assessment and restoration approaches and methods that trustees, and I can certainly, as a follow-up to this group, send links to all of the details for that.
So is the NOAA guidance what you use for all those individual settlements that you listed in the slide?
Not for all of them. Some of them are state-only, like the last three in the list, for example, were only pursued by the state. But, for example, with Bouchard, we worked under the Oil Pollution Act regulations, and for New Bedford Harbor and Housatonic, just for example, we worked under the Department of Interior regulations.
So like for the state only, like a J.P. Noonan one, how did you determine it was 55,000?
Well, actually, when we get to the restoration part of the program, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we actually did use a version of the method that we're proposing. So now we're going to sort of shift our focus from the broad to the more narrow, and particularly to give you a sense of what, in terms of today's discussion of the method and the proposed regulations, what that universe looks like in terms of spills. So when we say small to medium volume oil releases to surface waters, we thought it would be helpful to show you what that meant numerically. So in Massachusetts, between those 2 years, 2019 to 2017, All of the releases in our database total around 11.5 thousand spill releases. And of those releases, about 8,000 of those are releases of oil or oil/hazardous materials. So the vast majority of releases in our data set are related to oil or oil and hazardous materials.
What else is there?
Oh, just hazardous materials.
Oh,
Yeah.
so a combination of oil and hazardous.
Yes, exactly. Yep, thanks for, that was a clarifying question for those on the phone. When we talk about oil/hazardous materials, it's a combination, and the rest of the spills would be just considered hazardous materials.
Karen, one more question.
Yep.
When you say releases, these are all releases reported to DEP, so they're not just spills. They presumably, in fact, the majority of these are the discovery of historic contamination. I'm just trying to figure out, are these just spills, or is this any releases reported
Well,
to the department?
The 11,000 are all releases, and I don't know, Brian, if you can, or Liz can help me answer, like, with the 8,000 number, help answer that question.
Yeah, so that 11,000 is all, are all releases, so yeah, it would include spills, historic, contamination found, as well as that 8,000.
Threats of release? Good.
Very few threats of release.
Yeah.
But it would probably include the threats of release.
Unless it was retracted, but.
Okay, so for those on the phone, we were just clarifying that the releases also include, yes, how do you want me to describe it? That like
120-day historic.
120-day historic release
Yeah.
notifications.
As well as spills.
As well as spills and, yes, okay, thank you. So out of that 8,000, about 6.5 thousand are oil or oil and hazardous material releases that have submitted temporary or permanent solution statements. And of those, only almost 700, 693 were actually documented to reach a surface water. And out of those, only 517 were releases that made it to a surface water that were between 10 and 10,000 gallons, which is what we're proposing as the range for the applicability of the method that Scott's going to be speaking about.
Karen, will you be emailing this?
Yes,
Okay.
and it will also appear on our website.
Okay.
Yep.
So now that we've talked about that this was historical releases,
Mhm.
and then we've jumped to gallonage, how's that go? Because with a historical release, what are we translating into gallons?
I'm guessing all 517 were spills.
Correct.
Yeah,
Well,
probably.
517 were
Most of
spills.
them.
And
Were
that
new
is-
releases.
And that is as of 12/31/17.
But those are all just straight up
Correct.
spills.
Yes.
Correct.
So for those on the phone, the
Sorry.
517 are just spills, so that's why we know the gallons. Yes.
Sort of that dividing line is that some of them are historic, but at the point where something's hitting a surface water, it's not because somebody dug and tested the surface and found something that was there. It's
Right.
hitting the water, probably had to have been spilled. It'd be a very weird situation if that wasn't.
Right. I did not think of an example like that.
Right.
Not that it doesn't exist within there, but it was all releases where they knew the volume, where they were able to map the surface area impacted. There's nothing where they were out sampling and found something historic.
What about groundwater releases to
This
surface
does
water?
not, go ahead.
Oh, so we're actually going to talk about that in our April 23rd meeting. We'll talk about groundwater aspects. So, excellent. So, can we move on, or folks still have questions about the slide? We good? Great. Because I think at this point,
And if you have questions about the particular numbers, or you would be interested in different numbers for specific universes, feel free to email Karen, and we can put that together and email the information back out.
yep, for those on the phone, if you have specific queries about the data we have, either the numbers we've presented, or you were wondering about a particular combination of data, let us know, and Brian and I will work through it and come up with a response for you. So as a bridge to Scott's presentation, Once we got to that 517 spills to surface waters between those years, between those gallon ranges, I just wanted to give you a sense statewide and by watershed where those spills were located, just to give you a spatial orientation and get a sense of the distribution. And the reason we did this by watershed is you'll see later when we talk about restoration, we would like on the restoration side to take a watershed or sub-watershed approach. So we wanted to understand how things were mapped across the state. So we're going to switch now. We're going to switch speakers to Scott Friedman of Industrial Economics.
Karen, can I just ask one more?
Yep.
Just seeing those numbers. So, you know, the thing is like 70-something% oil or hazardous material, 70 or 80% of those spills. So what is the department's approach towards the other 20%? Because it seems like the ones where you have historically pursued NRD are like larger spills, not the small and medium ones.
Right. So the question is the department's approach to the 20% that are characterized as just hazardous materials. Well, it's interesting because it'll be the same approach to what you did see with some of the larger cases. It's really a case-specific assessment. So it would be a comprehensive assessment following similar or same approach that we would under the Oil Spill Act or under CERCLA. So we would basically take the same approach. And just as we're not necessarily applying the standard method to all oil spills, we wouldn't necessarily have every hazardous material site be a case.
I guess, you know, from our industry, there's just a little concern over that. Like, you know, we're doing business on one location. We have a spill, 30 gallons reaches surface water. The building right next to us has a hazardous material release, 30 gallons reaches surface water. You know, ours is more biodegradable, less bioaccumulating depending on the material. Because we fall in this oil umbrella, boom, we're getting hit with a fine on top of all the money we're spending doing the cleanup. The person next to us is probably not going to pay it.
Yeah, I think kind of that gets to some of the kind of bigger picture issues with this. And I think, as you probably know, and your point kind of brought it to the front, is a lot of the work that we've done, that list that you saw before, are the really big releases. And part of that is that, you know, that's where a lot of the damage is, you know, big damages. And right now, when the approach that we're taking now is a case by case by case by case approach, which takes a lot of resources from DEP's part and regulated communities' part. So, you know, we're spending our resources where we're getting the most, you know, bang for the buck, if you will, where the most damages are. What we realize is that because we're doing that, and because we have limited resources, there are a lot of releases. There are a lot of releases to the environment which cause damage, but which aren't being assessed, you know, whether it's oil or hazardous material. So kind of the basic question that we have is, given the resources that DEP has as a trustee, how can we look at all of the releases that cause damage and have some kind of assessment and settle the liability for all of these, not just the big ones? Because we're missing a lot of this, and we're missing a lot of damage. And cumulatively, and I'm probably jumping the gun, and
No, actually, it's good timing.
and very cumulatively, if you add up the effect of all of those small spills, you have more of an impact than these isolated large releases that we're dealing with. So kind of part of the answer to your question is by standardizing and simplifying the approach that we're taking for the developing and standardizing and simplifying approach for these smaller spills, we hope to be able to address more of them. We hope to be able to continue using resources to deal with big ones, but it also should free up some resources to do the site-specific assessments, like the Noonan spill, but for hazardous materials as well. That the the example that you have where you might have a spill or your clients may have a spill of oil to a wetland and the guy next door has a release of hydrochloric acid to a wetland. They both have impacts. To the extent that we can standardize the process for looking at both of them, we're going to try to do that. But to the extent that there are a wide variety of hazardous materials with a wide variety of impacts, and it's harder to standardize that process across all of that, that's where we want to put our case-by-case resources into. If we can standardize the oil side of things, because, you know, not that oil is oil, but it's like it involves 80% of our releases, and oil has, even across the different varieties, has similar sort of characteristics, like the fact that it biodegrades, and you can build that into the process. You can build recovery into the process, because we typically recover a lot of the oil spills, we cover some of them. So there are things that you can, it lends itself more to standardizing, and that would free up our resources to look specifically on a case-by-case basis